Welcome back, beautiful people. You're listening to A Moment of Zen right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York. I am your host, Zen Sams. Now, joining me in just a sec is Revere Securities President of Wealth Management, Kyle Wohl. He's extremely knowledgeable with investment banking and managing portfolios. Kyle appears regularly on the show, delivering a weekly business report to our listeners and viewers. And he's joined by his good friend, Frazer Rice, who is Regional Director for Pendleton Square Trust Company. Now, Frazer is a leading private wealth manager with 15 years experience advising millionaire and billionaire families on finances, fiduciary, and estate matters. He is the author and podcast host of Wealth Actually, and the book centers on decision-making for wealthy families. Now, the boys are going to be joining me to chat about generational wealth and best practices for young families. Now, let's chat wealth. Wealth is basically defined as assets or resources which are in excess of present or future expected expenses. Think about that. Or a more simple explanation is that wealth is made up of assets which exceed what will be needed for this generation and could be passed on to the next one. And even though wealthy families may not need their wealth for this generation, proper stewardship is required to make sure those assets will actually last for future generations. And as a mom, one of the main considerations in protecting wealth for my family's future generation is that the assets, they have to be sustainable over several generations, resistant to inflation and resistant to political and economic turmoil, which is almost impossible these days. But it is possible to invest in certain assets that can fortify your wealth against some of these external risks. Now, whether you are the first generation to create generational wealth or whether you are researching how to sustain the wealth you have inherited, Kyle and Frazer are here to give us some guidance. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Zen.
Absolutely. Now, Frazer, I read your book, and you are a master at really laying the law when it comes to making sure your assets endure the test of time, so to speak. Can you walk us through the biggest mistakes that you have encountered in your, in your career with people misplanning their generational wealth?
Sure. I can boil it down really to one huge mistake. And you alluded to it in your introductory comments, which is, there's lots of help and advice around making good investments and tax planning, dealing with geopolitical risk and things like that. But the biggest mistake that most families have in planning for the next generation and how they deal with money regards around communication. The biggest source of wealth destruction, in my experience, has been a lack of communication both between generations and amongst siblings of the same generation. Oftentimes, if you don't have a good situation where the values that created the wealth are transferred along with the value of the wealth, kids end up fighting, there's misunderstanding, and that leads to the worst of all situations, and that's litigation.
And of course, and you're talking about investment education, and it's not a coincidence that, being educated is extremely important in for a family structure, especially a family that wants their wealth to last and multiply for generations. And families like the Rockefellers have been able to build some enormous wealth and sustain it for multiple generations, in large part through the education of family members pertaining to the family's wealth. And then I remember reading that Nelson Rockefeller frequently told how his father gave each of his children an allowance of 25 cents, but if they wanted more money, they had to earn it by working. And he also required that they account for where all their money went. And these types of lessons are what is important to pass down to the next generation. So thank you for making that point. Kyle, when it comes to, you are you manage money, portfolios, this is your wheelhouse. What advice would you give to the average person when it comes to estate planning and doing this the proper way? It's important to start with a roadmap that plans the direction of the future sustainability of the family's wealth. And this roadmap should clearly outline how the wealth should be managed and invested. What's your take on this when people come to you for this?
I think really hiring professionals and having the right team makes the biggest difference when you're talking about wealthy families. Like, for example, at Revere Securities, Revere Wealth Management has Revere Family Office Services. And that's where not only do I get involved, I bring in professionals like Frazer who have 30 years experience working in trust and estate planning, and we bring in proper tax people, proper structuring people, so we can look at the family all encompassing and say, okay, this is what makes the most sense for you. And then we build the portfolio around the needs and the desires of the family. And I think having that proper team in place where you have 5 or 6 specialists is the real key.
Exactly. And for example, if your family has 50 million in assets, you want to seek an estate planning attorney who has a lot of experience with these amounts and the appropriate strategies. And as Frazer has defined in his book, it's time that people start early on. So even as a young mom, my husband and I, he's the CEO of a huge media company. And I like to bank on real estate. Now, for centuries, people have been using real estate to protect and grow their wealth. And this asset class is one of the better time-tested investments for generational wealth. I believe that real estate is a great hedge against inflation. Frazer, what do you say to that? Because I'm all about, let me buy as much as I can now so Alexa can have a whole bunch of buildings or homes that she can account for. Am I on the right path here?
Sure. I mean, I think anytime you're able to accumulate assets and have the power of compounding work for you, that is ultimately a really good secret to building generational wealth. Part of that too, though, I think is, along with the education process, is instilling good spending habits amongst the next generations. I think where people get in trouble sometimes is that when the next generations are used to a really high lifestyle but haven't developed their own sense of investing, asset allocation, or wealth generation, then you run into a real problem where sometimes the assets don't keep up with the spending that's in place. So I like the idea that you're talking about, where you help get assets to the next generation and get kids involved with investing. But I think it's important to have a good spending rationale and an education around what money can and can't do. And part of that is understanding what leverage can and can't do, so that your kids don't get in trouble later on.
And based on your kids not getting in trouble later on a financial level or misspending, what advice would you give, if you can give your, say, teenage children a piece of advice that are coming into young adulthood with respect to that? What would it be?
So I guess the major thing that I would say when putting together sort of thought processes around what you do for kids is just get them involved with money, so that they understand that if you have a portfolio, it's probably reasonable to assume that it can generate, say, 6 or 7% if it's aggressively invested in liquid stocks. But to assume that things will double or triple in the course of 3 or 4 years, that's where you can get in real trouble. And I think the idea of putting in guardrails or having an allowance in place. I like the tip that I got from a former golf pro who would give $5 to his kids, but then take $2 back to help illustrate the effect of taxes. That's the kind of tactic early on in a kid's education around money that I think you start learning those lessons, that they understand how real life works.
Without a doubt, without a doubt. Now, Kyle, this question is for you. I'm also about precious metals. I mean, gold and silver, are at the forefront of my brain, not because I like to gamble in this area, but precious metals have been considered money and a storage of wealth for over 2,000 years. Gold and silver are an integrated part of many cultures around the world as a form of money or storage of wealth, so to speak. And over centuries, gold and silver have been seen as the best forms of money for the reasons that it's divisible, it's durable, it's consistent, convenient. I could keep going on and on. What do you tell people that come to you and say, I want to invest in this area with respect to my generational wealth, and this is one way to safeguard it?
Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent and timely question right now, because when you have the inflation pressures coming that we're talking about, when you're having the money supply continuing to increase and we're worried about inflation, and then you also have the Fed talking about tapering, but not yet tapering, talking about raising interest rates, but that won't even happen until after the Fed ends tapering. So when you look at gold's, for the most part, it's a fixed commodity. So if the dollar does get weaker, theoretically, and most times through history, gold will get stronger, right? The same thing with silver. Now, how do you invest in gold is the real question. Do you actually buy physical gold and put it in your house? You can do that. Do you buy large amounts of physical gold and store them at the Federal Reserve Bank? You can do that, but they're going to charge you 50 basis points to 100 basis points for the storage? Or do you look at a truly liquid ETF like GLD? And that could be a great way for the average investor to go out and buy gold, have the liquidity, and it's fully backed in bullion, unlike most other ETFs.
Oh yeah, talking about bullion. I mean, regardless of the current public opinion of gold and silver, many Swiss vaults are lined with gold bullion from wealthy families who value gold as a permanent fixed part of their families. And let's move on to collectibles. Frazer, collectible. A collectible is an item that either currently has value, wealthy preservation, what we talk about as as a collectible, or will have greater value in the future. Speculation is a collectible item. So these types of collectibles are almost limitless, but paintings, artwork, stamps, vintage, wines, coins, rugs, and a lot of these collectibles are bought by wealthy families and are considered valuable. What do you say about preserving that in terms of a family heritage to children? Because I always like to teach Alexa that this is not just generational wealth, but it's also traditional things that we want to keep up.
Yeah, so collectibles are an interesting way to do that. If you have a car collection or paintings, they can be a source of education, not only about the value of the thing itself, but also the value of the family that purchased it and the values that sort of instructed why they thought it was important. I'd go a step further and say, collectibles are one manifestation of that kind of wealth. The family business is also an interesting manifestation of that. And it's a great way to teach kids where the wealth came from, what the responsibilities are of that family business, not only in generating wealth for the family, but in dealing with customers, dealing with vendors, the relationship within the community. All of that, I think, is a large component of the education process of where the wealth came from, why it's important to the family, and the responsibility of maintaining it and growing it in the future. So to get back to your collectibles comment, to have that in physical form, there's a lot of great education and history that can be taught, not only about the actual pieces of collectible, whatever form it may take, but also the way in which the family purchased it.
Without a doubt. And I'm all about making sure that my kids and my stepchildren, whom I love dearly, know how hard I'm working for them. So the family business, Romulus Entertainment, my husband's business, all of that gets passed on in a smart way. And how many investments, when you go back to collectibles, can you say that you get personal enjoyment out of from looking at them? Like owning an antique car is certainly more enjoyable than owning a piece of paper that says you own shares in company XYZ. But yes, I think it's all part and parcel to proper planning. And what Frazer, what you're teaching and what your book, Wealth Actually, really kind of guides people towards is this way of life. It's not necessarily just about money or wealth planning. It's about understanding and communications between families. And I think anybody who wants to get on the right track with respect to estate planning, generational wealth, should definitely read your book. Got a thumbs up from me, buddy. And Kyle, thank you so much for recommending he come on the show. This guy's awesome. And of course, Kyle, you're one of our best contributors here. So I thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Zen. Thanks
for having me on.
Absolutely. You guys are listening to A Moment of Zen. I'm your host, Zen Sams, live right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York. We will be right back after this. That was Kyle Wool, president of wealth management at Revere Securities, and Frazer Rice, book author of Wealth Actually. We'll be right back after this.